When I first arrived at the Culinary Institute of Chicago in the fall of 2015, I thought I'd finally found where I belonged. I remember walking into that marble-lined lobby with my rolling duffel bag in one hand and my grandmother's old recipe journal tucked under my arm like a Bible. The building smelled like herbs, garlic, and ambition. Everyone moved fast, like they already knew they were headed somewhere big. I was 23, fresh off a gap year where I'd worked at a soul food truck in Atlanta. I didn't come from a fancy culinary lineage or Michelin dreams. I came from home kitchens, church potlucks, and aluminum foil-covered leftovers that tasted better the next day. That first week, I met my roommate, Camille. She was everything I wasn't. Blonde, polished, French-trained since 15, and already dropping names like Gordon Ramsay and Dominique Crenn. When I unpacked and laid out my handwritten recipes, notes from my mom, scribbles from my grandma, she looked at them and chuckled. You know they're going to want innovation here, not cornbread, right? That was my first slap in the face. But it wouldn't be the last. In class, things got worse. We were introduced to Chef Landon, our lead instructor, the kind of guy who probably cried over truffle oil and ironed his apron. The first time I presented a dish in his lab, it was my grandmother's braised oxtail with stewed cabbage and cornbread croutons. The plate was clean, the flavors deep, the smell heavenly. At least I thought so. But he barely looked up before dismissing me. "Miss Green," he said, "this is more appropriate for a family picnic than a culinary institute." He gave me a 72. Passing, but barely. The humiliation stung. I walked back to my station and pretended not to hear Camille whisper, "At least bring something edible next time." I'll admit, for a while, I doubted myself. I started tweaking my recipes, trying to make them sound fancier. Black-eyed pea puree instead of bean mash. Charred collards instead of sautéed greens. But it never felt right. I was losing what made me, me. By mid-semester, I realized I was the punchline of the class. During group projects, I'd get pushed into prep work. When we presented dishes, my suggestions were shot down immediately. Bryce, another top student, Camille's sidekick, once said in front of the entire class, "Julia's dishes are stuck in the 1950s. Maybe she should open a food truck called Grandma's Kitchen." Everyone laughed. Even Chef Landon cracked a smile. I cried that night in the dorm bathroom with the shower running to muffle the sound. It wasn't just the criticism, it was the cruelty. I'd come here to learn, to grow. But they weren't trying to teach me. They were trying to erase me. One day, I brought in a peach-glazed chicken with jalapeno honey drizzle for a flavor pairing lab. I knew it was good. Even Landon paused after the first bite. But then he set his fork down and said, "Interesting, but not refined." Again, homey. That word, homey, started to feel like an insult, like it meant less than. The turning point came a few weeks later. We were assigned a final project, create a 5-course menu that showcased our culinary identity. For the first time, I decided to go all in. No French tweaks. No technical pretensions. Just dishes that told my story. I poured my heart into that project. I recreated the flavors of my childhood: smoky sweet potato soup, rosemary-crusted pork chops, molasses-baked beans, and my mom's famous lemon pound cake. I even sourced ingredients from a local Black-owned farm. It was soulful, rooted, real. The presentation day arrived. I plated every dish with care, every detail deliberate. When it was my turn to present, I stood tall. My hands were shaking, but I believed in every bite. Camille and Bryce were sitting in the front row, arms crossed, already smirking. I described my menu, talked about my upbringing in Detroit, and how food was how my family healed, celebrated, and remembered each other. Chef Landon tried the soup and barely held back a frown. Then the pork chop. He chewed thoughtfully, then leaned back in his chair. "I see what you were going for," he said slowly, "but this isn't what we expect from a fine dining institution. There's nothing here that would get you into a Michelin kitchen." Camille laughed. Bryce added, "This feels more like Cracker Barrel than cuisine." The room chuckled. I stood there, frozen. I was being mocked again for bringing myself to the table. I nodded, quietly packed up my tools, and left before they could finish the critique. That night, I sent an email to the registrar. I withdrew from the program. No degree. No farewell. Just silence. But as I stood outside that building for the last time, holding my grandmother's recipe book and fighting back tears, I made myself a quiet promise. One day, they'll eat these words. And they'll eat my food too. Walking away from culinary school felt like quitting a race I'd barely started, except the track was rigged, and the judges already had their favorites. I went back home to Detroit with my tail between my legs. My parents didn't say much. They knew I'd been struggling, but I don't think they realized how brutal it had been. I told them I needed to reassess my path, but inside, I was drowning in shame. I couldn't stop replaying that final day in my head, the Snickers, the way Chef Landon waved me off like I was wasting his time. But there was one thing I couldn't let go of, my menu. I kept the notes, the flavor pairings, the plating sketches, everything. I knew deep down that my food wasn't the problem. It was the system. The kind of system that glorified foam over flavor, pedigree over passion, and technique over heart. Still, self-doubt clung to me like grease on a stovetop. I tried applying to other culinary programs, smaller ones, more diverse ones. But the moment they saw I didn't finish the institute, the conversations cooled. My resume might as well have been blank. Eventually, I took a job at Miller's Grill, a greasy spoon on the east side of town. Open 24/7, sticky booths, and a staff that ran on sarcasm and too much caffeine. I told myself it was temporary, just something to keep me afloat. But I'll be honest, that place saved me. It wasn't glamorous. My apron smelled like bacon fat. The fryers groaned louder than the waitresses. But every day I cooked. And people loved the food. I'd slip in my own twists, a dash of Cajun spice in the cornbread, caramelized onion butter on the burgers, cinnamon in the coffee syrup. Regulars started requesting Julia-style specials. I got my confidence back dish by dish. Still, I kept a low profile. No big moves. No announcements. Until one day, about a year after leaving culinary school, I got a text from one of my old classmates, a girl named Priya. She was one of the few who had ever treated me with decency back at the institute. She sent me a link to an article. Camille Laurent and Bryce Hunter launched Chicago's trendiest new bistro, Reverie. There they were, posing in chef whites, talking about innovation and pushing culinary boundaries. The article said they were opening a French-Asian fusion spot in River North, backed by a celebrity investor. They even quoted Chef Landon. My stomach twisted. It wasn't just the success, it was that they were being praised for doing exactly what they used to mock me for. Camille's menu featured elevated comfort food with a southern twist. They were serving oxtail croquettes with yam puree. My food, repackaged, gentrified, sold at triple the price. I closed the article and stared at my phone for a long time. That old pain came rushing back, the humiliation, the laughter, the way I was made to feel less than. But this time, something inside me hardened. I wasn't angry. I was focused. If they could use my ideas and get applause, then it was proof. My food belonged. I just had to find my own stage. That night, I pulled out my grandmother's journal, the one I'd kept all these years, and started sketching a menu again. Not for school. Not for validation. For me. I decided to build something real, from the ground up. And I started small. I converted my parents' garage into a makeshift test kitchen. I bought a second-hand camera and began filming simple cooking videos, no ring lights, no aesthetic plating. Just real food, real voice, real stories. I called it Savory Truth. I told the story behind every dish, how my dad liked his ribs with apple cider vinegar, how my mom made collard greens when money was tight, how my grandma used to say that good food doesn't brag, it comforts. At first, no one watched. A few pity views from friends. maybe 10 likes on Instagram. But then one night, I posted a recipe video for bourbon peach glazed wings. One of the dishes from my final culinary school project. It hit 20,000 views in a week. A week later, Foodie Underground, a small blog, reposted it. Then came the DMs, the requests, the catering inquiries. I was cooking every day, packing orders from our driveway, delivering food in my beat-up Corolla, and staying up till 3 a.m. answering emails. I was broke, exhausted, and completely alive. And then it happened. A well-known food critic named Dion Kinney, known for spotlighting under-the-radar chefs, showed up at my parents' garage. "I don't normally come this far out," he said, biting into my honey chipotle short ribs, "but someone told me you're making magic here." The next morning, his review went viral. He called my food a spiritual homecoming on a plate. That phrase would follow me for years. Suddenly, I wasn't just a girl who dropped out of culinary school. I was Julia Green, the underground chef who didn't need a diploma to build an empire. But that moment was still a flicker, not a fire. I hadn't won yet. Not until they saw my name on something they couldn't ignore. And believe me, that day was coming. The day that review dropped, the one where Dion Kinney called my food a spiritual homecoming on a plate, everything changed. I woke up to over 3,000 new followers on my Savory Truth page. My inbox was flooded with messages, some from regular people asking where they could get my food, and some from investors, food bloggers, even chefs from actual restaurants asking to collaborate. One guy even asked if I wanted to intern in his kitchen, like I hadn't been feeding half the city out of my garage already. I smiled, politely declined, and got to work. My first priority was getting out of my parents' garage. Don't get me wrong, it had served its purpose. But I needed a real kitchen, a real space, and most importantly, a real identity for my food. I started looking at pop-up spaces around Detroit. Nothing fancy. Just a corner where I could hold tasting nights and test recipes without worrying about health codes or neighbors complaining about the smell of smoke and spice wafting through the driveway at midnight. Eventually, I landed on a spot, a dusty little rental inside Eastern Market, right next to a used bookshop and across from a local jazz bar. The place had been a failed juice bar, and the landlord practically begged me to take it off his hands. I struck a deal for 6 months with an option to extend. I called it Hearth. Just that. Simple, honest, familiar. I didn't have $1 million marketing budget. What I had were stories, soul, and spice. That and a fiercely loyal community who had followed me from my earliest food blog days. I designed everything myself, the logo, the menu, even the damn chalkboard signs. I brought in a local artist to paint a mural of my grandmother, her hands rolling biscuit dough, above the open kitchen. The first time I turned on the stove in that space, I cried. Not because I was scared, but because it finally felt like home. Our soft opening? Total chaos. We had 18 seats and 94 people showed up. I ran out of ribs by 7 p.m., cornbread by 7:15, and people still waited an hour just to try what was left, which, that night, was a smoky pinto bean stew with fried shallot topping and sweet chili glaze. People licked the bowls clean. By month 3, Hearth had a waiting list. A New York Times freelance food writer came through during a weekend trip and gave us a shout-out on Twitter, which spiraled into 3 podcasts, a YouTube food critics review that hit 1 million views, and a feature on the plate. Suddenly, my little corner of Detroit became the place foodies couldn't stop talking about. And just when I thought things couldn't get more surreal, I got an email from Chef Landon. I still remember reading it. "Julia, I recently came across your work. Very proud of what you've built. Incredible to see where your journey has taken you. If you're ever in Chicago, let's reconnect. Perhaps even guest lecture at the Institute?" I stared at the screen for a good 5 minutes. Not out of anger. Not even satisfaction. Just disbelief. This was the same man who once told me my food belonged at a picnic. Now he wanted me to teach his students. I didn't respond. Instead, I posted a new video on Savory Truth, talking about how home cooks, women of color, and so-called lowbrow cuisine had been sidelined in the culinary world for too long. I didn't name names, but I didn't have to. People knew. A few days later, a student from the Culinary Institute messaged me. She said, "Thank you. I've been afraid to make my abuela's recipes in class. Now I'm going to." That meant more to me than any Michelin star. But revenge, cold, methodical, undeniable, was still simmering on my back burner. Because while Hearth was blowing up, something else happened that made me sit up straighter. Camille and Bryce's restaurant, Reverie, it had just gone into temporary closure after a few critical reviews and low bookings. Word on the street? They were struggling to fill tables. Turns out, you can't just slap a southern twist on foie gras and call it revolutionary. Not when the soul is missing. And just like that, the tides were turning. But I wasn't ready to serve them their karma just yet. First, I needed to grow. Bigger, sharper, unignorable. So I did something bold. I started looking for funding to open a second location, one that would bring Hearth right into the culinary heart of the country, Chicago. I knew what I was walking into. I knew who I'd run into. And I couldn't wait. I'll never forget the feeling of stepping off the train in Chicago again. This time, I wasn't a nervous culinary student with dreams too big for her suitcase. I was a chef, a business owner, a woman with a waitlist 3 months long and a feature in Bon Appetit under her belt. And more importantly, I wasn't coming back to prove anything. I was coming to plant a flag. Chicago had always been a city of extremes, freezing wind, fiery ambition. The streets were sharp and fast, just like the food scene. And in the middle of it all was River West, where rent was high and egos were higher. That's where I opened the second location of Hearth, right on West Kinsey Street, in a narrow brick building that used to be a piano bar. The windows were stained glass. The floors? Original hardwood from the 1940s. It was perfect old bones, modern soul. The moment we put up the new Hearth sign, I knew this would be different. In Detroit, I built something out of necessity. In Chicago, I built something with intention. Everything was deliberate. The menu still celebrated the roots I came from, but now the plating was sharper, the techniques tighter. We still served fried green tomatoes, but they came stacked with goat cheese, mousse, and pickled shallots. Our collard greens were braised in smoked duck fat. And yes, the oxtail croquettes that once got me mocked in school, they were now the house special, paired with a tamarind glaze and served in trios on a cast iron slab. Opening night was packed. We had local chefs, journalists, influencers, and a table reserved for a mystery guest that turned out to be Chef Dion Kinney, the very same critic who'd written that game-changing review years ago. He hugged me in the kitchen, whispered, "Chicago doesn't know what's about to hit them." He was right. Within the first 2 weeks, the reviews rolled in. Finally, food that comforts without compromise. Hearth is the warmest meal and the boldest voice in the Chicago dining scene. Julia Green is redefining fine dining, one soulful dish at a time. But nothing compared to what happened in week 3. I was back in the kitchen finishing off a batch of peach-glazed short ribs when my general manager, Carlos, peeked in. He had that look, the one that meant someone interesting was in the building. "Table 6, he said. "You might want to handle this one yourself." I wiped my hands, walked into the dining room, and stopped cold. Camille and Bryce, sitting there like royalty, sipping cocktails and pretending to read the menu like they didn't already know what was on it. Camille was wearing a designer jacket and Bryce had his sleeves rolled to show off a pretentious tattoo of a truffle mushroom. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. In fact, I smiled. "Camille, Bryce," I said calmly, "welcome to Hearth. What brings you in?" Camille tilted her head and smiled. That same condescending smile I remembered from school. "We heard this was your place," she said. "We thought we'd see what all the buzz was about. Chicago's been talking." Bryce leaned back in his chair. "Yeah, and since Reverie's on a temporary break, We've got time to explore new concepts. Temporary break. Cute. I offered them a complimentary tasting menu. Not out of kindness, out of confidence. Every dish I served them that night had roots in the recipes they used to mock. I brought out the oxtail croquettes first. Bryce bit into one and paused, then said, "This is incredible." Next came the rosemary pork shoulder with apple sorghum glaze, one of the dishes I had served in my final culinary school presentation. Camille just whispered, "Wow." Dessert? Lemon pound cake brulee, my mother's classic, topped with lavender cream and a dash of sea salt. A tribute and a triumph. When I brought out the last course, Camille looked up at me and said quietly, "You've really made something special here, Julia." I smiled. "Thanks." It took being underestimated for years to get it just right. They paid the full check and left without asking for a picture. No job requests, no passive-aggressive compliments. They were stunned, quiet, humble, and that was more satisfying than any clapback could ever be. But the real cherry on top came later that night. After closing, I checked my inbox. There was an email, short and simple. Subject: Guest Lecture Invitation, CIC Faculty. Yes, the Culinary Institute. They wanted me to speak. They wanted my story, my journey, my insights on flavor. The same institution that once told me my food was too homey now wanted to use it as a teaching point. I sat there in my office at Hearth, looking at the restaurant filled with laughter, soul music, and satisfied customers, and I realized something. This wasn't just my comeback. This was a reclamation. I wasn't the girl who dropped out anymore. I was the woman they couldn't ignore. After Camille and Bryce's unexpected visit to Hearth, things got quiet. Too quiet. No social media posts. No snide comments. No follow-up messages. Just silence, the kind that buzzes like an unplugged wire, full of static and unspoken tension. But I knew what was happening. They tasted something they couldn't untaste. Something real. Something earned. Something they tried to imitate and failed. And now, they didn't know what to do with that. But I did. I waited. 3 months later, I got a message, a DM from Camille of all people. "Hey Julia, hope you're well. Loved the food at Hearth. I'm between gigs right now. Any chance you're hiring? Would love to work under someone as inspiring as you." Under me. Let that sink in. The girl who once called my food Cracker Barrel cuisine now wanted to work for me. I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I started planning something special. You see, I had never truly closed the loop. I'd outgrown them, yes. I'd succeeded beyond what they thought I was capable of, but there was still a small, simmering piece of me that wanted to look them in the eye and show them what they tried to destroy. So I reached out to a former classmate, Priya, the only one from school who never laughed at me, and pitched an idea. What if I host a CIC alumni night at Hearth? Private tasting. Industry only. A sort of, look where we all ended up kind of thing. She laughed and said, "You're evil." I love it. So we sent the invites. Kept it classy. Private event. Cocktail attire. Exclusive tasting menu. I made sure Camille and Bryce got theirs. I even invited Chef Landon. He RSVP'd immediately. The night of the event, we shut the restaurant to the public and transformed it into something almost surreal. Jazz trio in the corner. Soft lighting. Framed childhood food photos on the walls. On the menu, I listed each course by the year it was originally rejected, 2016, 2017. Along with the quote that had dismissed it. First up, too rustic to be plated. Braised short rib over stone-ground grits with beet just reduction. Second course, comfort food isn't cuisine. Fried chicken thigh with lavender honey glaze, collard green roulade. Dessert, this dish lacks sophistication. Lemon pound cake brulee with hibiscus syrup and creme fraiche. Each quote printed right underneath the name. The guests caught on quickly. By the time the third course came out, everyone was whispering. People kept glancing at Camille and Bryce, who who were sitting at table 4, faces frozen in tight, polite smiles. Chef Landon hadn't touched his wine. But I wasn't done. When dessert arrived, I walked out of the kitchen myself. No apron. Just me, clean and composed. I stood in front of the room and gave a short toast. When I was a student at the Culinary Institute, I was told that my food didn't belong in the fine dining world, that it was too humble, too homey. But I learned that food is like a story. It doesn't need your permission to matter. It just needs someone to taste it. So tonight's menu is a love letter to rejection. Because sometimes, rejection is just the world's way of clearing space for your real table. Applause. Real applause. Not the kind people give to be polite, the kind that comes from somewhere deep, like they felt what I said. I locked eyes with Chef Landon. He gave a small nod, his face unreadable. Camille didn't clap. After the event, while guests were mingling, she approached me near the back bar. Bryce hung back, pretending to check his phone. "Julia," she said, "I know I wasn't exactly kind in school. I just wanted to say." I held up my hand. "It's fine," I said. "You don't have to rewrite the past." I remember it clearly. There was a long pause. Then she said the quiet part out loud. "I just wish I'd taken your food seriously back then." I leaned in slightly and replied, "That's okay. You're not the only one who's eating their words now." I walked away before she could respond. Later that night, Chef Landon found me in the kitchen. Everyone else had left. He looked older, softer, somehow. "I was wrong," he said simply. I looked at him, measured him. Then I said, "You weren't just wrong, Chef. You were loud about it." He nodded. Then he said something that, to this day, still echoes in my head. There's a difference between knowing how to cook and knowing how to feed people. You've always done the second. I just didn't understand it until now. I let him walk out without saying a word, because I didn't need to say anything. Hearth had said it all for me. You'd think after that alumni night, after watching Camille and Bryce squirm through every bite of food they once belittled, after hearing Chef Landon admit he was wrong, I'd feel like the story was finished. But I didn't. Not yet. Because while that private night was deeply satisfying, it was still quiet. It was a closed room. A whisper between walls. I wanted the industry to hear me. The world. I wanted my story, my food, to exist on a platform where it could no longer be ignored, minimized, or mistaken for coincidence. And then, the opportunity fell right into my lap. I was invited to speak at the Midwest Culinary Expo, the same one Chef Landon used to brag about every year. Back when I was just the home-cooked girl with too much vinegar and too little discipline, as he once put it. This time, though, I wasn't a guest. I was the keynote speaker. I remember standing behind the stage curtain that morning, holding the clicker for my slides, wearing a simple navy blue blazer and gold hoop earrings, my grandmother's. My hands were steady, my voice calm. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. The audience? Full of chefs in starched whites, food writers, young culinary students scribbling notes, and, in the second row, 3 seats in Chef Landon. Sitting stiffly, trying not to look uncomfortable. Perfect. I stepped onto the stage and clicked to the first slide, a faded photo of my mom and grandma in our Detroit kitchen, flour on their aprons, laughing. Then I spoke. My name is Julia Green. I dropped out of one of the most prestigious culinary schools in the country. I was told my food lacked sophistication, that it was homey, rustic, and unrefined. I was laughed at, humiliated, and told there was no space for the kind of flavors I loved. I paused. So I built my own table. I talked about how the culinary world often gatekeeps taste, how it celebrates French sauces while dismissing collard greens, how fine dining loves to borrow from ethnic dishes but forgets the people who created them. I wasn't angry. I wasn't preaching. I was just real. Then I clicked to the second slide, a photo of my restaurant, Hearth, filled with customers, music, and food that looked like home and art at the same time. There's nothing wrong with refinement, I said. But when you confuse exclusivity with excellence, you lose the soul of food. The auditorium went still, the kind of silence you can feel. Then I clicked to the final slide, my original tasting menu, the one from culinary school, the same one they laughed at. Underneath, a simple line. Now served at Hearth. 3 locations. 6-month waitlist. And I ended with this. I don't need a star to validate my food. My food was never for the stars. It was for the people who thought they didn't belong in this world, just like I once didn't. And now, I cook for all of them. The room erupted in applause. Not polite applause. Not corporate claps. A full, rising, standing ovation. I scanned the crowd. Students were on their feet. So were a few of the older chefs, some with tears in their eyes. One woman mouthed, "Thank you." Chef Landon didn't stand, but he clapped. Slowly, carefully, with a small nod. After the talk, I stepped off stage and was swarmed. Media, students, reporters asking for interviews, chefs offering partnerships. One student, a young black girl named Nia, ran up to me in tears and said, I was just about to quit school. They told me my Haitian food wasn't high-end enough. But hearing you just changed everything for me. I hugged her and whispered, keep cooking the food that made you. That moment was everything I had ever fought for. It wasn't just about proving my haters wrong anymore. It was about proving the system wrong and showing everyone watching that there is power in staying rooted. And the final stroke of poetic justice? 2 weeks after the keynote, I got another email from Camille. I know this might sound wild, but if you ever decide to open a Hearth branch in LA, I'd love to run it. No ego, just admiration. You built something amazing. I didn't reply. Not because I was bitter, but because I didn't need to. She wasn't the audience anymore. Everyone else was. If you told me back in 2017, the night I walked out of culinary school with nothing but a recipe notebook and a bruised heart, that I'd one day own 3 restaurants, give keynote speeches, and turn down job requests from the very people who mocked me, I wouldn't have believed you. But here I am. Today, Hearth has 3 thriving locations. The original in Detroit, the flagship in Chicago, and our newest spot in Brooklyn, right in Fort Greene, a tribute to the Black community that helped shape American food, but rarely gets the credit. We didn't chase stars. We didn't chase approval. We chased truth, and taste followed. We've been featured in the New York Times, Eater, Food and Wine, even a segment on Netflix's Table and Flame. But the real win? The real moment that hit me in the chest? It wasn't press. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Detroit. We were hosting a private lunch for local teachers, just a thank you event. No cameras. No fanfare. Just real people. One older woman sat down at the chef's table, wrinkled hands, floral blouse, tired eyes. She took one bite of our peach bourbon cobbler, paused, and looked up at me with tears in her eyes. My mother used to make this exact thing every Sunday in Georgia. I haven't tasted that memory in 40 years. I nearly lost it. That's when I knew I was doing what I was meant to do, not perform for prestige, but feed people what they didn't even know they were starving for. At Hearth, every table tells a story. We don't number our dishes, we name them. The Annie Special, Sunday Best, Reclaim Plate, and my favorite, the Dropout's Revenge. That one? That's the same tasting menu they laughed at in school. Now it's our bestseller. Now it's sold out almost every night. Now, people wait months to try the food that was once called too simple. I mentor students now, especially the ones who don't fit the mold. The ones who speak softly but cook loudly. I tell them, don't change your flavor to fit the plate. Change the plate. Some of my proteges have gone on to start their own ventures, from food trucks to community kitchens to pop-up bistros that honor heritage over hype. I support every single one of them because I remember what it felt like to have no one in your corner. Camille? Last I heard, she was trying to start a food podcast. Bryce ended up as a consultant for a tech-based meal kit company, still chasing innovation instead of authenticity. And Chef Landon? He's now retired. Word is, he teaches part-time and uses one of my old interviews in his lesson on how the industry is evolving. Imagine that. The girl who didn't graduate being taught as curriculum. But the truth is, I don't need any of their names anymore. They're not my story. My story is in every customer who comes in and finds something they didn't know they missed. In every dish that whispers, you belong. In every kid who watches me on stage and realizes they don't have to ask permission to be great. People think revenge is about destruction. But sometimes, the coldest revenge is simply doing what they said you couldn't, better than they ever dreamed.